the Acting Director of Communication Research Center. I'd like to welcome you all to this semester's Melvin DeFleur Distinguished Lecture. And to start off, let me remind you all to turn on your cell so that it doesn't disrupt our lecture. Our lecturer today is Dr. Diana Mutz from University of Pennsylvania, where she is Samuel A. Stauffer Chair in Political Science and Communication. And she is also the director of the Institute for the Study of Citizens and Politics at the Edinburgh Public Policy Center. Dr. Mutz teaches and does research on public opinion, political psychology, and mass political behavior, with a particular emphasis on political communication. Dr. Mutz has published articles in a great variety of academic journals, including American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, Public Opinion Quarterly, Journal of Politics, and Journal of Communication. All of them are top-tier journals in the respective fields. She is also the author of 3 books. The first one, In Personal Influence, How Perceptions of Mass Collectives Affect Political Attitudes. This is a book that is awarded with the Robert Lane Prize for the best book in political psychology by the American Political Science Association in 2006. Her second book, Hearing the Other Side, Deliberative versus Participatory Democracy, which was awarded the 2007 Goldsmith Prize by Harvard University and the Robert Lane Prize again by APSA. So very outstanding achievement. Her latest book is called Population-Based Survey Experiments, that provides the first book-length treatment of the new method drawing examples from across the disciplines in social sciences. She was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2008 and has been a non-resident Fellow of the esteemed Brookings Institution since 2007. Before Penn, Professor Mutz taught at University of Wisconsin-Madison and also the Ohio State University. Today, Dr. Mutz will deliver a talk that is truly relevant to the upcoming election. As you can see from the screen, it's in your face politics, television, and the intensification of political emotions. Well, without much ado, please welcome Dr. Mutz.
Thank you all very much, and thank you for the warm welcome, and I'm truly honored to be part of this Distinguished Lecture series. What I'm going to talk about today is actually a book that I'm writing right now, and it's based on research I've done over a large number of years. But it came out of an earlier interest I had in how people's face-to-face political discussions tended to be very much with like-minded others rather than those who had differing political views. And often I found the only exposure people had to political views that were different from their own was through mass media and through television in particular. And that was kind of an aside in a previous book I did, but many people pointed out to me, you know, being exposed to oppositional views on television is really a very different experience from being exposed to them in a face-to-face situation. And I think that's absolutely true. And really the topic of this book is the important ways in which that kind of exposure is quite different. So first of all, what do I mean by in-your-face politics? Well, first and foremost, it refers to how political television violates a whole lot of different social norms that we have for face-to-face kinds of political discussions of our views. One of the most obvious ways it does this, which no one here is unaware of, is through violating norms for politeness and civility. In the world of face-to-face discussion, most people are polite most of the time. The norm for exchanges of political views when they do happen is to be very polite about it. And this is an extremely strong social norm. Yes, there are occasions when certain people will jump up and down and scream at one another over political differences of opinion, but that's actually extremely rare. What's more, research on civility tells us that the norms that we have in face-to-face discussions for civility are not arbitrary norms like using the correct fork at a dinner party. They're really a means means that we have of demonstrating mutual respect for one another. So they have important consequences. Calls for greater civility are really common these days. You've all seen them. These are sample headlines from the press, all asserting that public discourse has become too uncivil. Likewise, after the shooting in Arizona by Jared Loughner, many people jumped to blame the incivility of political discourse for that event. Now, I don't think there's been any convincing evidence of this, but it does illustrate people's frustration with public discourse and just how much they think it's gone too far. And finally, academics have also complained a great deal about the lack of civility in political discourse these days. Two examples here, one from my former university president, Judy Roden, who argued that, no one seems to question the premise that political debate has become too extreme, too confrontational, too coarse. But when you think about it, it's really interesting in a way, because if there's so much consensus out there that political discourse has become too uncivil, you got to ask yourself why we still have so much of it. Why is it proliferating, given that there seems to be this consensus? All you have to do is, turn on any television talk show these days, and you'll hear people talking over one another, raising their voices, interrupting, and so on and so forth. There's lots and lots of examples out there, no shortage of incivility, despite this public disdain that we apparently have for it. These are just a few examples that I came up with from the recent past. What I want to do next is I want to show you a brief excerpt, about 5 minutes. It may seem longer given the nature of the excerpt, but really it's only 5 minutes. But it exemplifies a lot of what I mean by in-your-face politics. It serves as a good example. So let me do that first here. See if we can get it going.
Didn't you many times vote against whole packages of spending when you would have gladly gone for a smaller package?
Well, I didn't make speeches about them, and I didn't put them in my platform. Right here's what John Kerry put out as far as his U.S. Senate platform was. He was talking about he wanted to cancel the MX missile, the B-1 bomber, the anti-satellite system. I mean, this is not voting for something that was in a big bill.
Which of those systems was effective in either Afghanistan or Iraq? The MX certainly wasn't, thank God, nor was
this is front and back, and it's 2 pages. I've got more documentation here than they've got at the New York Public Library and the Library of Congress. I knew you was going to be coming with all of that stuff, and I knew that these people from the Kerry campaign would be coming with all this kind of stuff. That's just baloney. Look at the record. A man's record is what he is.
I agree. I'm just
a man's campaign record. What?
I'm just asking you, Senator, do you mean to say, I know there's rhetoric in campaigns, I just want to know, do you mean to say that you really believe that John Kerry and Ted Kennedy do not believe in defending the country?
Well, look at their votes. Wait a minute. I said I didn't question their patriotism.
No, do you believe that they don't believe in defending the country?
What?
Do you believe they want to defend the country?
Look, I applaud what John Kerry did as far as volunteering to go to Vietnam. I applaud what he did when he volunteered for combat. I admire that and I respect that. And I acknowledge that. I've said that many times.
Right. But I'm just asking you.
I think his record is atrocious.
Well, let me ask you, when the Democrats come out, as they often do, liberal Democrats, and attack conservatives and say they want to starve little kids, they want to get rid of education, they want to kill the old people. That kind of rhetoric is not educational, is it?
Now, this is your program, and I'm a guest on your program,
yes,
so I want to try to be as nice as I possibly can be. Where I can get a little closer up into your face. But I don't stand here and listen to that kind of stuff. I didn't say anything about not feeding poor kids. What are you doing?
No, I'm saying,
Well, you're saying a bunch of baloney that didn't have anything to do with what I stood up there on the road.
okay, you believe, Senator, truthfully, that John Kerry wants to defend the country with spitballs. You believe that?
That was a metaphor, wasn't it?
Well, what do you mean by that?
Wait a minute, he certainly does not want to defend the country with the B-1 bomber, or the B-2 bomber, or the Harrier jet, or the Apache helicopter, or all those other things that I mentioned, and there were even more of them than here. You've got to quit taking these Democratic talking points and using
No,
what
I'm
they
using
said.
your talking points and asking you if you really believe them.
Well, use John Kerry's talking points from what he's had to say on the floor of the Senate, where he talked about them being occupiers, where he put out this whenever he was running for the U.S. Senate, about what he wanted to cancel. Cancel, to me, means do away with.
What did you mean by the
I
fact?
think we ought to cancel this interview.
Well, that would be my loss, Senator. That would be my loss. Let me ask you about this because I think you have a view on the role of reporters in the world. You said it has often been said so truthfully that it is the soldier, not the reporter, who has given us the freedom of the press. Was there not?
You believe that?
Well, of course it's
You
true.
believe that?
But it's a statement that nobody would have challenged. Why did you make it? It seems like no one would deny what you say. So what's your
Well,
point?
it evidently got a rise out of you.
Well,
You're a reporter.
I think that's right.
To do with
Well,
freedom of
you
the
could
press.
argue it was not nurses who defended the freedom of nursing. Why did you single out freedom of the press to say it was the soldiers that defended it and not the reporters? We all know that. Why did you say it?
Well, because I thought it needed to be said at this particular time.
Because you
I wanted
could
to
get
go
an
on top.
applause line against the media at a conservative convention.
No, I said it because it was. You're hopeless. I wish I was over there. In fact, I wish that we lived in the. I wish we lived in the days. I wish we lived in.
We're in it. I gotta warn you, we're in a tough part of town over here. But I do recommend you come over because I like you. Let me tell you this: if a Republican senator broke ranks, a Republican senator broke ranks and came over and spoke for the Democrats, would you respect him?
Yes. Why? I would. I've seen that happen from time to time. Look.
What did Jim Jefferson say to you? Jim Jefferson Vermont switched parties and
You're going to ask the question.
Well, that's a tough question. It takes a few words.
Get out of my face. You're going to ask the question. Sit back and let me answer. You know, I wish we lived in the day where you could challenge a person to a duel. Don't pull that kind of stuff on me like you did that young lady when you had her there browbeating her to death.
Yeah, well,
I'm not her.
I'm
not her.
Let me tell you, she was the
You get in my face, I'm going to get back in your face.
and I was
The only reason you're doing it.
Okay. I think you've had enough. So, there's several things I like about this example, other than the fact that it gave me the idea for my book title. One of the things I like about it is that it's actually kind of uncomfortable to watch. You get this kind of visceral, like, ooh, from watching this kind of conflict. Also, I like that Miller at many points in time points out the norm violations that are taking place. For example, he says, I'm a guest on your program, so I'm going to try to be as nice to you as I can. The idea that when we're someone's guest, we treat them a certain way. That's from the face-to-face world, that norm. He also points to the artifice of the fact that they're not even in the same place, in the same physical location. And one of the things that I find in my research is that the greatest incivility in political discourse on television occurs in this format with people in boxes in different locations. And this is interesting because, in fact, many people, like Ted Koppel, for example, on Nightline, even if you were there in the studio, he'd make you go to the studio next door so you could pop up on the box on the screen for you to talk to him. And when you ask yourself, why do that? It's because it's a lot easier to violate norms for civility when the person isn't actually there in the face-to-face environment with you. We are very much socialized to being polite in most face-to-face situations, and so it's a lot easier when the person isn't physically there. Finally, he also reminds us that it's not entirely obvious that politicians are any less civil these days than they were in the past. And I think we sometimes forget that people used to resolve their political differences of opinion by dueling. When Aaron Burr had his famous duel with Alexander Hamilton, it resulted in Hamilton's death. And granted, it wasn't on YouTube and didn't get covered by television, but when you think about that kind of thing, it does make the kind of screaming and yelling that we see a lot of these days seem downright placid. Personally, I'm not convinced that politicians these days, in terms of their personal behavior, are actually any less civil than they used to be. I've not seen any convincing evidence of this historically, if we consider the longer view of history. But what I do believe is that the way we as citizens experience this incivility is very different now from what it was in the past. And this leads me to the second part of my definition of in-your-face politics, which is that basically, not only do we have incivility that violates social norms and from face-to-face context, the second thing I mean by in-your-face politics is that, quite literally, television gives us perspective where we're actually in people's faces, much more so than we are in face-to-face everyday life. When you disagree with someone in a face-to-face situation, without even being aware of it, you back off. You put greater distance between yourself and the person that you're disagreeing with. And this has been documented at cocktail parties and all kinds of psych experiments as well. It's a natural reaction to put more physical distance between people who disagree. Interestingly, on television, that's when they go in for the extreme close-up of the flaring nostrils and the sweat beating up on their foreheads and so forth. So, for example, if you were in a room, let's say, with the president watching his speech, the way that you would view him, your visual perspective on him, would probably be roughly like you're seeing me now. I don't feel your entire visual perspective. But on television, the norm is often much more like this. And meaning that it's really common to have camera shots these days where we cut people's heads off and partially decapitate them here. Now when you think about it, few people will ever be close enough to George Bush to see him from this visual perspective. I mean, you got to be really up close to somebody. Maybe his wife Laura, is that close in his face so that his head fills her entire visual perspective. But this is common when we experience politicians and political advocates on television. And you could say, well, that's irrelevant, but research on face-to-face disagreement suggests it's not at all irrelevant. Perceptions of physical closeness have important implications for how people react, particularly to people they don't like, to people they disagree with. And what we know about the reaction is that it increases the intensity of their emotional responses to others. There's a really well-known psych experiment back from the 1970s where they demonstrated this in a face-to-face situation. And what they did was they'd have a person come in, they'd sit them down in a room, and they'd say, you're about to meet another person, you're going to talk to them. They didn't talk at all about politics, but they gave the person a questionnaire that the person they were about to meet had supposedly filled out. And it was purposely rigged so that the person coming in either looked like they were really different from you in their views, or they were very similar to you. And you won't be surprised to find that when the same person, the same Confederate came in, people were more likely to say after the interaction that they liked the person that they assumed was like them in terms of political attitudes than the person who was unlike them. But what was even more interesting is they also randomly assigned people to either have this Confederate come sit right next to them or to sit across the table from them. And what they found is that when they thought this was somebody that wasn't at all like them, and that person sat right next to them, they really disliked them. So close proximity intensifies our feelings, and particularly when someone that we have negative feelings about. When we feel when they violate our personal space, it creates more intense negative reactions. So basically, television is in your face in two different respects, both in this violating norms for civility, but also in terms of violating norms for appropriate social distance. This is the kinds of shots that we see, close-up camera perspectives, that produce an impression of physical closeness. You see this in print media these days as well as on television. It's probably a lot more prevalent on television. Now, if you're not convinced that spatial distance matters, at least in the non-mediated world, let me call to mind another example that happened in 2011 with the State of the Union address, when there was this movement, the significance attached to the fact that the Republicans were no longer going to sit on one side of the aisle and Democrats on the other. They were actually going to mix them up and make Republicans sit next to Democrats. Oh no. How will we survive? Well, what's interesting was what a big deal this was. And it actually did continue in 2012 as well. But they made a big deal about these enemies actually sitting next to one another And we had, here's the seating chart. You can see the Democrats and Republicans seated every other one, kind of like boy, girl, in kindergarten or something. So it may seem kind of ridiculous. Oh, well, we can't sit next to one another when we have different political views. But there was a lot of significance attached to this as far as creating a more civil political environment. But do any of these things really make a difference in the media world? That's really the question here. And it seems to me that there are two possibilities out there. One suggests that, we don't know television is television. We know that the norms on television are different from the norms in day-to-day life. And so probably people understand that the television world is not the real world. And as a result, these kinds of violations of face-to-face norms that are so common on TV are not all that consequential for how we react. The television norms are different from face-to-face ones, but that doesn't really affect us. On the other hand, there's a second possibility, and that is that people do respond to the human beings they see on television in fundamentally social ways. That is, as if it were an actual social interaction. And if that's true, then we should see important consequences from these violations of social norms. Now, I'm not suggesting that people think others are going to jump out of the TV into their laps. Obviously, people know that that's not going to happen. You've probably, there's a genre of videos on YouTube that's very funny where it's people's animals jumping at the TV screen and attacking other animals on the screen and so on and so forth because they treat them like they're real. Well, a lot of emerging research on human media interactions suggests that our brains fundamentally have not evolved to the point where we're capable of changing our reactions to representational media with the knowledge that it is just media after all. We don't know television is television. We know that the norms on television are different from the norms in day-to-day life. And so probably people understand that the television world is not the real world. And as a result, these kinds of violations of face-to-face norms that are so common on TV are not all that consequential for how we react. The television norms are different from face-to-face ones, but that doesn't really affect us. On the other hand, there's a second possibility, and that is that people do respond to the human beings they see on television in fundamentally social ways. That is, as if it were an actual social interaction. And if that's true, then we should see important consequences from these violations of social norms. Now, I'm not suggesting that people think others are going to jump out of the TV into their laps. Obviously, people know that that's not going to happen. There's a genre of videos on YouTube that's very funny where it's people's animals jumping at the TV screen and attacking other animals on the screen and so on and so forth because they treat them like they're real. Well, a lot of emerging research on human media interactions suggests that our brains fundamentally have not evolved to the point where we're capable of changing our reactions to representational media with the knowledge that it is just media after all and just a screen. So according to this line of thinking, there's no switch in the brain that we can just turn on and off that instantly says, oh, that's not a real person, this is a real person. And as a result of that, we treat visual stimuli that look like real people as if they are real people. Humans basically respond to things that they see and that look real because of the relative newness of representation technology, at least in the course of evolutionary history. Now, this sounds a little far-fetched. Let me give you a few examples of this. To some extent, we all know this. If you're in a movie theater and the train appears to come towards you, you automatically pull back. Well, is that because you think the train's going to hit you? Of course not. But we do it without thinking. It's a reaction we have because our brains are saying there's something big and dangerous coming at your face. It's also true that motion demands attention in the real world. When something comes at us and is in motion, we automatically orient toward it. And the same thing happens on the television screen when someone appears to be coming toward us. A lot of studies of brain activity, and it isn't that different when a person appears to come toward you on a TV screen from what it is when a real person walks towards you. There are also some really wonderful examples from the realm of studying human-computer interaction. For example, they've done experiments where they'll have a person come in, sit down in front of a computer, use a program, and so forth, and then they'll either half the people will stay there and evaluate that computer's performance to its face, and the other half will go into another room and use a second computer to evaluate the first computer's performance. Well, if people treat media in a social way, what that means is that will be systematically more negative about that first computer if we go behind its back and use the second computer to evaluate the first computer. And in fact, that's exactly what happens. Now, when this study first came out, a bunch of people in Silicon Valley said, oh, these people are just anthropomorphizing computers, it's silly, you know, they're just naive and so forth. So they had a bunch of Silicon Valley employees run through the same experiment as subjects. Not exactly the same thing. We respond to media in fundamentally social ways, even though we're really not aware we're doing it, and it makes absolutely no sense to do it. My other favorite one about computers is that they generally, you won't be real surprised to hear this, but computers that speak with a male voice are judged to be faster, bigger CPUs, you know, all those kinds of things. There's only one exception to that general finding, and that is if the computer is running a program on love and relationships, the female voice computer comes out stronger. So as you can see, stereotypes from the face-to-face world do make their way into technology, into the media environment. So the argument here is that people expect mediated people to obey the same kinds of social rules that we do, even though it doesn't make any sense. So my research question that I ask in my book is whether people respond differently to television because it mimics real-world interaction while simultaneously violating the social norms for face-to-face interaction. And the raw materials that I'm working with in my book are 8 different laboratory experiments that I did over a period of many years. Also a content analysis of the visual aspects of television over time. Survey data on who watches in-your-face television, as well as looking at just how in-your-face various types of programming actually are. So my preliminary organization of the book right now looks something like this. There are 3 sections, several chapters in each section. The first one really highlights some of the experimental work where I show with the ability to make strong causal inferences in a lab what the effects are of in-your-face politics that we ought to care about. Secondly, I look at under what conditions these effects seem to matter, and I look at really the generalizability of these findings. I'm not going to talk much about that section today, but then finally I'll talk at the end about some of the historical implications as well that come out of looking at long-term changes in the visual content of television. Okay, what did I do? Well, I started out working on this topic by basically producing my own experimental stimuli. And I did this because I wanted to maximize the control I had over the content that people are exposed to. So I basically did experiments where I had the exact same broadcast, but I manipulated the appearance of physical distance between the viewer and the politician by using primarily close-ups versus medium shots. And I kept the clinical content and the people in the video the same, but changed levels of civility versus incivility in the exchange. How did I do that? Well, I actually used a set that's used for a political talk show and made it look like it was the show Indiana Week in Review, which is an actual program on local politics in the state of Indiana. On this set, we had a moderator who you see to your left, and 2 candidates on the right. They're both actors, but one of them, I actually shot this while I was living in California. One of the actors is actually a failed candidate for Congress in California. In any case, they were said to be 2 candidates for a 5th District congressional seat, an open seat in the state of Indiana. And basically, after the establishing shot, in the versions that were medium shots, mainly you have this kind of perspective on the candidates as they spoke, whereas in the close-up conditions, you have not the entire broadcast, but a huge proportion of it consisted of close-ups going back and forth. So this was a 4-camera shoot so that I could have the exact same events shot through different camera perspectives throughout the program. These candidates talked about 8 different issues, and so different experiments draw on different issue debates. I didn't use the whole content for all of them. And basically, the moderator brought up the agenda for the question, and these 2 went at it, and we used things off websites for the actual candidates for the content of their issue positions and so forth. So the deal with the actors was they had to stick to the script, they had to, stick to what the political views were that they were supposed to say. However, in one run-through, it was civil, it was very polite. In the second one, we did a run-through where they were encouraged to raise their voices, interrupt, talk over one another, roll their eyes while the other guy was talking. Basically the kinds of things that you might see on one of the more uncivil kinds of political talk shows. So the whole point was to try to keep everything else the same. Now, I should tell you, in terms of the level of incivility in this program, we're not talking the Jerry Springer show. Even the uncivil version of the program was actually not terrible. And the reason for that is, in order to keep the content the same, you can't have them espouse more extreme views in one version than another and so forth. So they had to stick to the same content, and that put constraints on just how uncivil they could actually get. We seem to have a problem here. Technical problem. Yeah, I don't know what this is. Okay, I will just go past it. Basically, in this 4-camera shoot, we ended together in the end 4 different versions of the program. And they talked about issues that were big for congressional candidates at the time. As a result of this, we had them professionally edited. As a result of this, we had different versions of the broadcast that we could use in all 4 of the different combinations of civil, uncivil, and close-up or medium shot. What happened to people when they came into our lab, we recruited subjects through temporary employment agencies primarily, and also through civic groups that we would make a donation for every person they got to show up. But they were adult subjects, these were not college students. They sat in our lab, watched about 20 to 30 minutes of programming. They answered questions on a pre-test questionnaire as well as on a post-test. In addition, because we were interested in emotional reactions, they were hooked up to skin conductance measures. Skin conductance is a means of tapping people's levels of emotional arousal. It doesn't tell you what emotion they're feeling, whether they're happy or sad or whatever, but it does give you a good indicator of their level of emotional arousal. So our interest here was in seeing whether these different versions affected people the same way that face-to-face discussion does. And what we know is people's level of arousal tend to go up when norms are violated through disagreement and incivility, as well as through violating people's personal space. So very first study I did predicted this, basically, that the bright red corner, the combination of civil and close-up, should produce the highest level of arousal, because that should be the one where we violated the most social norms. And that the civil medium should be least arousing. And in fact, if you look at the results here, that's exactly what you see. On the right-hand side, you see the average level of arousal while viewing for those who saw the uncivil broadcast. All definitely way higher than those who saw the civil version. But even within civil and uncivil, you can see the difference that close-ups make. Close-ups raise people's levels of arousal. They cause them to respond with much more emotional intensity. And as a result, we usually see in self-reported kinds of attitudes as well, stronger views than we might if they had viewed the same thing in another fashion. So basically, in terms of arousal, what we see is that both of these things independently increase levels of arousal. Arousal is a really important thing because it predicts attention. We pay attention to things that are arousing, and lots of evidence it's a wonderful measure of attention. And what this does suggest is that they are responding very much the way they would in a real-world setting to the same kind of thing. Because arousal predicts attention, I therefore predicted that people are going to remember a lot more from the highly arousing versions of these presentations. Both incivility and close-ups ought to increase recall for things that were said in the program. So, okay, they dropped that for some reason. I have no idea what's going on technologically. There were bars there. But basically, the effects that you see here are, that you don't see here, are ones where civility has lower levels of recall for program content than incivility, okay? Same thing for close-ups. The highly arousing content that caused people, the uncivil and close-up, also caused them to remember more of what was said. So at this point, you kind of say, wow, you know, that's a good thing. It's attention-grabbing. People remember it. It's also true that these kinds of exchanges get replayed over and over and over, and they often make it to YouTube and places like that because they're arousing for people to watch, because they violate social norms. So at this point, your reaction might be, well, it's not all bad, right? Here's a comparison of recall, but breaking it down by how much people learn about arguments for their own side of an issue versus the other side of the issue. And what you see here is virtually an identical pattern on both sides. That is, recall went up regardless, and it went up particularly in the condition where it was close up and uncivil together. The control group here watched a video of the same length, but it was on improving your free throw shooting in basketball. Very, very little political relevance there. There's a guy who's made a video of about a half an hour who is the all-time champion free throw shooter. He's not an NBA player or anything like that. All he does is shoot free throws. In any case, what you see here is that, pulling back to my original concern, is people are learning about arguments for the opposing issue position from these kinds of broadcasts. They're learning something about people that they're probably never going to talk to in their face-to-face lives. And again, you look at that and you say, that's probably serving an important purpose. But the question that I ask next is, it's one thing to remember, right, what was said. How is the perceived legitimacy of those arguments that the opposition is making affected by the way that you experience it on television? And I looked at this in two ways. I looked at it first by looking at attitudes toward the candidate they didn't like, okay? So the one that they least favored. Secondly, I looked at their assessment of the legitimacy of the arguments that were made on the side of the issues they didn't agree with, okay? And each of these issues were different. But the idea here is that, about 50% of the time, we're not on the winning side. Our candidate doesn't win. And yet, the legitimacy of the system rests on the idea that we think the opposition has a legitimate right to govern us, right? So we have to believe that there are legitimate bases for oppositional views for the system to work correctly. What did I find? Well, if you look here, this is the difference in how they evaluated the candidate they liked and the candidate they disliked, okay? The gap between the two. And what you see here is that all of the action is on the right-hand side, the close-up conditions. The close-up conditions, there's a big gap between how much you like one candidate and how much you hate the other if you were in the uncivil close-up condition. And there's much less of a gap if you were in the civil condition. What that means is that when we violate these social norms, people may remember a lot, but they're coming away thinking that the opposition is a total jerk. Basically, we like who we like even more, and we hate who we hate even more. It intensifies people's feelings, just as you'd expect, based on the levels of arousal that they see. This is, again, thermometer ratings of evaluating the least favored and most favored candidate, and what's important about this is it doesn't affect people's attitudes for the candidate they like at all. What this means is that the research I'm talking about here, it's not something political consultants are going to run out and use, because the candidate you already like is not really changing your attitude toward him, but it is changing your attitude toward the least liked candidate. So it's really attitudes toward the opposition that in-your-face politics has significant effects on. This is the evaluations of the legitimacy of all those arguments made on the other side. And what you see here is, again, all the action is in the close-up conditions relative to the legitimacy people in the control condition gave to those various issue arguments. If you were in the close-up condition and it was uncivil, you thought those arguments were a bunch of hogwash, just really stupid, illegitimate kinds of things. On the other hand, if you were in the close-up civil condition, you did grant them that they had a legitimate position, that opposition. Now keep in mind, nobody said anything different across these conditions. They're all espousing exactly the same political viewpoint. So this is just about the way the camera shot them and the level of civility in their exchange. So it does matter, and especially matters when we have presentations that are truly in our faces. So just to summarize the findings thus far, what I find is that many of the effects of incivility are contingent upon this in-your-face nature of television exposure. So relative to not watching at all, that is the control condition, any version of these programs that people might watch, if you can get them to watch it, will improve their knowledge, their recall of issue arguments, and so on and so forth. But when they view this uncivil kind of thing, it leads them to denigrate the legitimacy of the other side. They think the other side has no legitimate basis for their views, and as a result, their views become more polarized. Essentially, what they're doing is demonizing the opposition. Here are two great examples of that, where we're going to extremes to characterize the candidate that we don't like as not just not my preferred choice, but as totally actually evil. And this is the kind of thing that in a polarized environment is obviously a grave concern. Final kind of effect I looked at in the lab was looking at effects on trust in government. The idea that TV might hurt levels of trust in government has been around a long, long time, but the actual evidence of it has been limited to one or two programs that have been studied. The term video malaise has been coined to refer to it, but it's never been exactly clear what it is about the content of television that's supposed to have this effect that might exacerbate people's declining trust in government and so forth. And so I included batteries of trust in government in my experiments to see whether or not violating social norms would make people think less of government in general. And keep in mind, these people weren't part of government. The people who were acting as them, they were just candidates for office. Nonetheless, we had whopping effects on trust in government. Viewing the televised portrayal that involved people violating norms for social distance as well as incivility greatly decreased people's level of trust in politicians, but it also had highly significant effects on trust in Congress and trust in the system of government. And that's just from one 20-minute broadcast, watching this kind of thing. So that's a pretty big effect for such a small one-time exposure. Another one where the findings dropped out there. Basically, what we find is that incivility causes people to think less of politicians and government. And what this particular slide showed was relative to a control condition, people who saw the uncivil were more negative. Relative to a control condition, people who are in the civil condition thought better of government. So these kinds of programs have the potential to do both things, to improve as well as make them worse as attitudes toward government. Primarily, the effect is in a negative direction. Final thing I want to say about trust in government is, again, harking back to my theoretical explanation for this, which is that, people are responding this way because they have very visceral reactions to conflict when it's presented this way. What you see here is a scale that was developed to study conflict in face-to-face situations. People are different. Some people like a good fight and like arguing, and other people despise it and are really uncomfortable with it. And what we did is we took this scale about how much you're comfortable with face-to-face conflict and looked at the size of the effects of these programs based on their level of comfort with conflict. And what you see is highly conflict-avoiding people are particularly likely to be affected by such presentations. Low conflict avoidance people was no significant effect at all. So it's true that how you feel about conflict in face-to-face situations affects how you feel about it in other situations as well. So basically, highly arousing content produces greater recall, but also more negative attitudes toward disliked politicians and their ideas. So this is the quandary. And I think Bill O'Reilly kind of summed it up nicely. He pointed out that if a producer can get someone who eggs on conservative listeners to spout off, provides liberals into shouting back, he's got a good show. And one of the things that we find in absolutely every experiment I've done is a pattern that looks like this. You ask people if they want to watch the show again, if they would watch it at home, et cetera, there's no difference in how much information they think they got from civil versus uncivil, but there's a significant difference in the entertainment value. People like watching the uncivil versions. They will tell you they need incivility, and yet, and this is something, again, that comes out of evolutionary theory, we're kind of hardwired to pay attention to conflict. When there's a conflict in our environment, we look, we pay attention, not because we like it necessarily, but because conflict demands our attention. And the analogy that I like to give people is really rubbernecking on the highway. When we go by an accident and we look, it's not because we're sick people and we want to see a dead body or anything like that, but we often can't help but look. because it's important information in our environment. And the same thing seems to happen with incivility as well. It is more entertaining. People indicate much higher likelihood of watching again and so forth. And there's lots of evidence that things that are conflictual, that are tense, that create that sense of arousal in the viewer do in fact get big ratings. Or political television, and that, I'll say that caveat, political television is a loss leader. You know, political television isn't very popular with anyone but political junkies. And so the hard part about all this is, you know, how do we get people who aren't inherently interested in politics to pay attention? Generalizability of various effects, I'm not going to talk much about here because for lack of time, but basically I'm looking at things like gender differences, like does it matter if we put candidates, parties on these candidates and so on and so forth? Does it matter if we use still pictures rather than video? And the answer is yes, it does in some of these cases. But I want to talk a little more about the historical implications because for me, the immediate thing that was of interest about this is whether or not this is really about television, this theory. Or is it that, you know, incivility, even if it was covered by a newspaper, would produce these same kinds of reactions in people? And what I found was I basically took the same experiment, took the same stimuli, and in addition to the video version, I did a radio version, you know, audio only, and a newspaper version. Now, how do you do a newspaper version? Well, we did it like a debate transcript that might appear in the New York Times, where essentially, you know, what the candidate said was there for people to read who are in the newspaper commission. And the fascinating thing about this is that right at the point where we did our manipulation check to see whether or not people perceived the two different versions as different in levels of civility, the audio-visual version, just like in our previous ones, we see that, in fact, yes, the uncivil condition is perceived as much more uncivil. In the audio-only, not so much. It is just barely significantly different. And in the print version, they're not different at all. And part of what we're seeing is that the emotional content of this confrontation doesn't come through in print like it does when you can see people's faces on a television screen. And so in that sense, I think it is very much about television. It's not that if we could get people to perceive it as equally hostile, they might not react the same way. It's that it's very hard to convey emotional intensity in print versions. Finally, is television visually different now from how it was in the past? Obviously, we've had the rise of the talking heads, kind of talk show format and so forth. I wanted to look at something that was a program available over a long period of time. Oh, unfortunately, we don't have the figures here either. All the lines and bars have fallen off. I'll tell you what it looks like. Basically, the number of conflicts that appear in television news, we coded each of those conflicts. We coded for their visual content. So not, you know, what they said, but rather how they looked, what we were looking at. So what you'd see here is going back to the 1960s, clear up to the present, the intensity of featured conflicts has increased, even just on the evening news broadcast. Which is interesting because most people, when they think about instability, they think strictly about things like talk shows. But what we find is that it's true even of something like television news. Can't see this either. Also, there's a much higher percentage now than there was in the past of conflicts that feature identifiable faces in the news. In addition, the proportion of the TV screen that's taken up by the human body, how close they're being shot from, that has also increased, as has the realism of human images that are used on the news. Now, let me give you some examples of this that aren't on a graphic so that you can actually see them. The use of close-ups has also increased. Now, let me give you some examples of this that aren't on a graphic so that you can actually see them. The use of close-ups has also increased. This is a 1969 broadcast with Chet Huntley. Look at how much space his body takes up of the screen, and also look at the visuals. You can see it's actually a drawing in the background. It's not a photograph. This is a story from that same broadcast about unemployment. I actually thought Akron was in Ohio, but apparently there's one in Pennsylvania too. And he talks about unemployment in Akron, and this is the visual, you know, that comes with the news. This is from 2009. If you look at Brian Williams, you'll notice that he takes up a much larger proportion of the screen now than in the news in the past. The faces appear closer to us than they used to. This is also actually a story about unemployment that aired in 2009. And of course what happens now is that the story will be on the anchor briefly, but then they immediately cut to out of studio video. And in this case, this is a woman who recently lost her job. A tear is rolling down her cheek. And of course, we're seeing her, again, from this extreme close-up perspective. I was a film student as an undergrad, and you know, we learned this in film school. If you want emotional intensity, use close-ups. That's kind of a standard thing that you learn when you're making films. This hasn't been lost on people. Now, when you ask yourself, why is it that even the anchor is shot this way? In some sense, it's technological change. I mean, cameras used to be these big, heavy things that sat in one place. And it wasn't nearly as easy as it is now to get this kind of extreme close-up perspective easily. What I argue ultimately is that the visual nature of television combined with, again, the competition to get more viewers has lent itself to increasing interface politics, meaning that we're trying to make political television more interesting to viewers. We're trying to draw in more viewers, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in the process, by virtue of using these mechanisms, we have some unfortunate side effects. This is a time series looking at partisans' ratings of their own party over time. And what you can see, with their own parties over time, you get basically flat lines. They still like people just as much as they ever did. On the other hand, if you look at the right-hand side, partisans' ratings of the opposing side, you see a clear decline. And what we see as a shift in public opinion is just like the pattern of my experiments, where what we see is people dislike those they dislike more intensely. Not that they have changed the way they feel about the candidates and parties and so forth that they favored. So it coincides very nicely with the rise of individual politics in the graphs that you couldn't see. Ultimately, the question we're left with is, what do we do? Political television is kind of a market failure in the sense that the kinds of things that draw in viewers, that grab their attention, and that increase their recall and so forth, aren't the kinds of things that create the kinds of attitudes we'd ideally want toward government and politics. And again, O'Reilly said, if you want civility, you can watch PBS. And he's actually, he's right. There's several news out there, civil television, but it doesn't get huge audiences. And so ultimately, that's a problem, because no amount of civil television or civil discourse out there is going to benefit the American public if they don't watch it, ultimately. So I'm going to end here, and hopefully we can talk a little bit about what we might do about this state of affairs as well. I'll end with a headline from back in 2002, which pointed out that, incoherent outrage is fun. Watching the Zell Miller, Chris Matthews thing is kind of fun to watch. But the system does suffer. Individual citizens' attitudes are changed, and it also creates a situation where the legitimacy of the opposition is injured as a result. So let me stop there and open things up for questions.
We have some time to take questions from the floor. Yes.
I guess this would be more like a which came first, or kind of question.
Mm-hmm.
Was the change in television because of a change in actual discoursive rhetoric, or was a change in the actual rhetoric in the divide, as a partisan divide? Has that come about because of the change in television? Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, we know that political elites are more polarized now, but the evidence about the mass public is that they're not so much, but elites clearly are. I can't tell you that I have the historical data on the tone of discourse over time, because in a large part we use media as a record of that. That makes it difficult. But what I would suggest is that it's competition. It's the huge amount of airtime, and talk shows are pretty easy. Talking heads don't cost as much as other kinds of programs news. But talking heads, when they're civil, it's pretty darn boring. I'll tell you, one of our experimental subjects fell asleep. He was in the civil medium condition. And it isn't arousing, I'll tell you. It is dull. And that's really, I think, the problem that we face right expect people to watch political television when, let's face it, they got a lot of other channels, a lot of good movies on, a lot of other things that are far more arousing. How are we going to draw them in? I'd love to hear your ideas. I have a couple of my own, but the question is, we're human beings. We're not going to, because we feel like we need to be good citizens, force ourselves to watch something boring.
I'm curious about, I'm sure you watch the debates, and the different networks use different camera techniques to cover them. If you watch the debates on CNN, they always had the split screen. They never stopped the boxes, little boxes. And but some of the other networks, PBS, for instance, pulled back. And so I think if you watched it on PBS, it was a much cooler kind of interaction. If you watched it on CNN, especially the Biden debate, I mean, you talk about facial expressions. So I don't know what I guess my question is that whether the producers of those debates, the television producers, were trying to create heat by the way they use those
I don't know the actual answer to that. I know that certainly they're well aware of the impact of physical space between the candidates and the candidates, the moderator, that has. It's a very different thing when candidates walk toward each other in an environment like the town hall meeting and they actually physically move. It's also, if you notice, it's, when they're physically close to each other, I found the split screen thing kind of weird when they were looking away. You know what I mean? Sometimes you see the screen, they each look the opposite direction, and our brains interpret it as their backs are to one another almost. On the other hand, when they were like that and were, going at one another, often they turned in the Biden debate. That is, they actually, with the split screen, looked like they were shouting nose to nose in a way, and that should intensify people's reactions to it. Whether they did that approach with the knowledge of that, I don't know. I think they certainly know that they want viewers, and they know that whatever they can do surrounding their coverage, whether it be polls or the spin meisters and so forth, they'll use that as a means of doing it. I don't know. If there's any kind of strategy involved, but I think you're absolutely right. It does change the way you experience it, and I think in this case we have a situation where they're actually physically in the same space. You could show them next to each other together. And instead we put them in these little artificial boxes, which is kind of bizarre when you think about it. I mean, you know why people do that when it's New York talking to San Francisco, because they have to. They can't put them together. But in this case, you didn't need to.
Could just some of the basic technological changes increase intensity? For example, TVs we used to watch were a lot smaller.
They're much bigger.
Screen. They're much bigger. Could the change from standard definition to high definition?
Yep, it's more realistic. And one of the graphs that didn't show up due to the technology here was in fact showing the increased size of the television set. They got larger at the same time. They got more micro and smaller. They moved the smaller ones and built the larger ones. But overall, big screens are increasingly popular and portable and so forth. And you got to wonder, some of these screens are so big. Like my parents have a really large screen television, and at one point I had a CD of, it's literally just like squirrels and birds, and it's supposed to be catnip video. And I put my cat in front of the screen. All of a sudden, there's a 6-foot-tall squirrel in front of it. And what did he do? Like any smart cat, he ran. He went the other way. It wasn't, no longer was this something for him to go after. This was a monster squirrel. And it was just my own little experiment. But yeah, no, his brain said, this is dangerous, But you got to wonder, because sometimes people are bigger than life on our screens now. They're kind of scary.
There's a question over here.
Oh, okay.
Rhonda?
So what about intense debates like the one we've seen the past month, plus the social media, the Twitter that's happening at the same time? How does that intensify the experience of the viewer?
I don't know if it intensifies the actual viewing experience, because if you're distracted and sending out messages, I'm not sure it's as much, maybe the same. But what I do know happens is that the studies of this that have recently come out, your level of arousal influences how likely you are to tell someone else about something that happens. And it doesn't even matter if the thing itself is what's caused the arousal. So for example, they use an experiment where they expose people to a bunch of information and they make them jog in place while they do it, and because that enhances your level of arousal. They're 10 times more likely to actually tell other people things they learn while aroused. So it's not, I mean, it's also true that the more intense moments get replayed on other channels on the next day's news and so on and so forth. So you get more attention when you're uncivil, but you also get people talking about it more when that happens. And it's funny, because I was trying to think if that happens in face-to-face situations. Maybe it does in the form of gossip. Like, I was thinking in a situation you're at a dinner party and maybe the couple across the table is arguing throughout dinner. And, you know, even though you're not involved in the argument, you still feel kind of uncomfortable about people arguing across the table. And I was thinking, okay, am I therefore, even though I'm a third party observer, I'm just likely to get up and tell other people about it? It's possible. It works in that situation too. But what we know is that information transmission, the likelihood of secondary information being transmitted via people, via Twitter, via whatever, goes up if it's arousing. Yeah. So it works. Yeah.
You know, this is actually a little connected to what Barton just mentioned about screen size, because I was wondering if you're thinking about also taking into account, like on a computer screen, where today we can watch things and it's not just the distance of sitting back and watching a TV, but it's actually really in your face, you know, even more on a screen, but also that, and so that's one part, but also because now we can watch videos over and over again, we can adjust the screen size and it's literally just a foot away from us. The idea that increased arousal can make us even want to share things more, you know, so these kind of behavioral effects as well.
I can give you the citation. I didn't do the study, I wish I had, but actually somebody at Penn did it who's in our business school. And arousal increases the social transmission. You're much more likely to email it to somebody else. If it's an article, you're more likely to share a video, all those kinds of things. And this guy also studied like the most emailed items on various websites. And each of these items was rated for its level of arousal that it caused. And again, the high arousal ones are the ones that are likely to be circulated most. Yeah. Yes?
But do you think it could also have a positive, like the arousal could have a positive effect? Because with Twitter, for example, a lot of the conversation was like a live stream of fact checking. So while, yeah, you have like 50 big bird, like, you'll also have people who are like live fact checking. So if at first you really didn't like what someone said, you might end up liking it later because you have those facts in front of you.
Yeah, it's possible. The one thing that I actually have a grad student who's on the market right now who's giving a talk. Part of what happens though is fact checking doesn't turn out to be all that effective at changing people's minds about what's true and false. And even when it does, it's really interesting. Even when people say, yeah, I know that to be false, it has what are called belief echo effects, meaning that it continues to affect their attitudes, even though they know it is not correct information. And the part of the problem is we're not very good at processing negation. So if I say, Nina is a crook, what you think is crook, Nina, oh my, you know, and you associate those two things. And so later on, I can tell you, even 5 seconds later, actually, I just made that up. There's nothing true about that. Nonetheless, you now have an association linking crook and Nina in your mind. And one of the things that she's studying is how can we go about actually correcting beliefs, updating our beliefs in response to corrections that occur in the press. Because obviously it's a problem when, even when you go out and correct a mistake that's in the press right away, it still seems to have lingering effects on people's attitudes. And these aren't just partisan rationalizations either. It affects even partisans who don't want to believe it. She does lots of libeling of political candidates saying they were, you know, accepted money from a convicted felon, and, you know, the kinds of things that you see every day in the press. But then tells people, oh, actually, that's not true. Well, they still have a systematically more negative attitude toward the candidate than those who've never heard of it.
Is it sort of related to sleeper effect?
A little bit, but it's not a sleeper. That is, you can find it even right away. You don't have to let time pass in order to see that. And the one way that does seem to correct it in some way is an affirmation rather than negation. So for example, if I, instead of saying Nina is not a crook, and all you think of is crook, oh, that's a bad thing, Nina, bad thing, okay. Instead, I say Nina is a fine, citizen. So I actually affirm the positive rather than just negating the negative. Negating a negative isn't a positive thing. Saying something bad about someone lowers your view of them, but saying, oh, they're not bad doesn't make you more positive toward them. So instead, you have to say something more positive to offset it. That's very difficult for journalism to do because you're not in the habit of trying to correct things via affirmations rather than just saying, oh, correction, there's no evidence that it is correct. And there's not, just in case you wonder.
Do you find that live broadcasts versus like already televised, like commercials have a different impact? Like a lot of the presidential, like both presidential candidates have commercials, and I find that they're always narrowed in on their faces. But does that have a different effect than a live broadcast would?
I don't think so. I don't think our brains process whether it's live or recorded or whatever. It's just like tiny infants react to human faces, and we are very much hardwired to react to faces, especially when they appear to be physically close to us. When they're teeny tiny things way out there, we really don't react in the same way. It's also true that you can read the emotional content of someone's face when they're up close, and when you can't when they're distant. So yeah, no, I don't think it makes much of a difference. But it also, as far as the ad context goes, if you already like a candidate, you tend to think that incivility is righteous indignation. Well, of course he had to say that because the other guy was attacking him. And it's the reason why, even when candidates are uncivil in a debate kind of context, you rarely ever see people moved away from the choice that they had to begin with as a result of that. But you can see them think less of the opposition for their behavior. So we have a double standard when it comes to the politicians we like to know.
I think this is the time we have.
Okay.
So let's thank Professor Mutz for that.